Greetings, folks. Nice to see you again. My name is Dustin Cormier. Welcome to How to Rock Astrology. Today we're going to be getting into more juicy stuff. This might just be a short little episode talking about... Actually, it might not. This is an important, a huge concept in Jyotish that is not even touched, or it's just not... There's no consciousness of it in Western astrology. The roots of what makes up the friendship between two planets and the enemy relations between two planets has to do ultimately with, you know, how I was saying that there are considered evil house rulerships. We would see evilness in the positions from one mula tricona to the two constellations that a planet owns. And here's what I mean. I'm just going to show you, just to give you a sense of the nature of friendship in enmity. Let's take, for example, Leo, okay? The sun, all right? Now, we're going to consider the sun in its relationship with Venus. What might it be? What kind of relationship does the sun have with Venus? Well, they're enemies. The sun does terrible in the sign of Libra, where it's debilitated, as well as the sign of Taurus, at least by dignity's sake, because Venus is an enemy. Now, why is Venus an enemy to Leo? It doesn't talk about it in this book, but this book just basically more is explaining the terms. But I want you guys to know that I learned from Ryan Kirksack of Asheville Vedic Astrology when I took his apprenticeship course. I learned from him that it has everything to do with the relationship of a mula tricona of a planet with the other planets' ruled constellations. So we know from our diagram that the mula tricona of the sun is Leo. It's its most important place. It's its root energy. So, if the mula tricona of the sun is Leo, where is Libra from Leo? Well, Libra is in the third house from Leo. The third house is a pushy, Mars-ish house, as we're going to learn when we get into the houses. It's an ill placement. In the same way that Saturn, remember Saturn, cast a third house aspect wherever it goes. That third house energy always has a Saturnian influence. Now, the 10th house from any mula tricona is also considered an evil placement. Doesn't say the 10th house is bad, but it's one of the rules which defines positive versus negative friendship between a mula tricona and a ruling constellation. So Libra and Taurus are both in ill places from Leo, where the sun gets its source energy. And that's why Venus is considered an enemy to the sun. Now, of course, when you look at the sun's position from Libra, which is Venus's mula tricona, the Leo is the sun's only ruling constellation. And Leo happens to be in the 11th house from Libra, which is also considered an evil house placement in Vedic astrology. Now, unfortunately, you're just going to have to kind of take my word on that until we get to the houses. But this is just giving you a glimpse of the logic. There is a mathematical framework to where this friendship and enmity is coming from. Now, that's enough of my own spiel. We're going to start taking it more from light on life. This is friendliness and enmity between planets. Jyotish is often taught by assigning human attributes to the grahas. And planetary relationship is a case in point. If a planet is not exalted, debilitated, in its own mula tricona or in its own constellation, its strength is decided on the basis of the relationship between the planet and the ruler of the constellation in which it sits. So the basis of the relationship between the planet and the ruler of the constellation in which it sits. So if the sun is in Libra, it's going to be having a hard time because Venus is an enemy to the sun. The grahas may be friendly, inimical, or neutral towards each other, as is shown in the following table. So I've gone through and given us examples, a picture of all the planets and their friendships. Now you'll notice, just to give you some neuroprogramming, that Sun, Moon, Mars, and Jupiter are just about always grouped together. So the Sun, these are the friendships and enemies of the Sun. The Sun's friends are Mars, Jupiter, and the Moon. I talk about in many of my astrology videos, I group these four into one grouping, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Moon. And then I group these three, Mercury, Saturn, and Venus, into another grouping. The logic behind this is the fact that, this is something for everybody to consider. Notice that the Sun rules Leo, which is a fire sign. The Moon rules Cancer, which is a water sign. And Mars and Jupiter both rule fire and water signs, right? Mars rules Aries and Scorpio. Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces. Cancer by the Moon is water. Fire from the Sun, Leo, is fire. So they're grouped together, and it makes sense that these three planets will be friends with the Sun. Now, we'll also notice that Mercury, Saturn, and Venus also similarly rule Earth and air signs. Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, air and earth. Saturn rules Capricorn, earth. Aquarius, air. And Venus rules Taurus, which is earth, and Libra, which is air. So we can see a bit of a divide going on there, and that's going to trickle through. Although it's amazing, of course, that you'll also notice that, the planets, the signs that Mars rules, Scorpio and Aries, are in positive relationships to Leo, the Sun's Mula Tricona, right? Scorpio is the 4th house from Leo, and Aries is the 9th house from Leo. And that's why the Sun has a positive relationship to Leo. Now let's look at Jupiter. Sagittarius is the 5th house from Leo, whereas Pisces is the 8th house from Leo. So these are all things that, those rules for what makes a good house or a bad house is things that we'll just have to get to eventually, but it's not even necessarily that the 8th would always necessarily be a good or bad place. It's just a certain set of rules that I don't think this book talks about, but that information is available, especially again through Ryan Kirksack's teachings on astrology, as well as I believe in the work of Parashara as well. That's where Ryan got it from, and so you'll find that in Parashara. I don't have the official verse quote. It's probably in my notes from my apprenticeship, but I digress. So sticking to our point, the wheres and whys and hows of all this friendships is not as important right now. For now, let's just listen to the friendships that every astrologer does agree on. So we can see the Sun's friends are Mars, Jupiter, and the Moon. Mercury is neutral to the Sun. And then Saturn and Venus are enemies to the Sun. Next we have the Moon. You'll note that things do change around. It's interesting that the Moon is, although it's one of the spiritual planets, it's ruled by water, relating to Sun, Mars, Moon, and Mercury. Sun, Mars, Moon, and Jupiter, rather. The Moon is still Mercury is a friend to the Moon. Earthy Mercury, which has to do with living and being balanced between the self within and the world outside the self. And Mercury just happens to be a friend for those reasons. It's said in Jyotish that the Moon has no enemies and that Jupiter is an enemy to none. Jupiter, the great benefic, is not an enemy to any planet. So the moon has no enemies. These four, Mars, Venus, and Jupiter and Saturn, are neutral to the moon. And when the moon is in the sign of Mars, in the sign of Venus, in the sign of Jupiter, it is considered neutral. It's only when the moon is in Leo, Gemini, or Virgo that it gains the positive dignity of being in a friend sign. For Mars, its friends are again Sun, Moon, and Jupiter. Neutral to Mars is Venus and Saturn, and the one enemy to the hard, logical, rational Mars is the overthinking, over-analytical Mercury, which stops Mars from doing what Mars is supposed to do, which is having the experience, shooting from the hip, leaning on its rational reason, acting on its rational reasoning. Mars is actually supposed to be our action that is guided by Mercury's reasoning. But when these two come together, Mars reasons and thinks before it acts, and it gets frozen and paralyzed in thought. You guys seeing me okay here? Good. For Mercury, Mercury's friendships are towards the Sun and Venus. You notice that Mars is neutral to Mercury. This goes to show that, it's just like any human relationships, one person can get along well with another person, and they don't mind them so much. You don't bother me at all. In fact, I can get a lot out of you for what you are and who you are. But for all I know, I could be an enemy to you, and I could grind your gears and frustrate you. So, Mercury's friends are the Sun and Venus. Mercury does well in the signs of Leo, as well as the signs of Libra and Taurus. Mercury is neutral in the sign of Aries, Scorpio, Pisces, Sagittarius, Capricorn, and Aquarius. And the moon is starved and struggles in the sign of Cancer. Of course, these friendships are also important when we're considering if Mercury is trine the moon, or if Mercury is trine the moon, that's good for the moon because, as we know, Mercury isn't a friend to the moon. So it often happens. It happens in my chart. I've got the moon associated with Mercury in the same sign, in Sagittarius. This is good for my moon because my moon's intuition and feelings gain the sensation and openness of Mercury. But Mercury loses some of its openness. It loses some of its objectivity by being drowned by my moon's emotional needs. Because the moon is an enemy to Mercury, but Mercury is a friend to the moon. Of course, again, Jupiter's friends are Sun, Moon, and Mars. Jupiter does great in the signs of Leo, Cancer, where it's exalted, and Aries and Scorpio. Saturn is neutral to Jupiter, and Jupiter's enemies are the Rajasic planets, Mercury and Venus, Venus's style of love is different from Jupiter's style of love. Venus and Jupiter together can become a little bit indulgent, where Venus is actually delighted because Venus has, any planet conjunct or associated with Jupiter is delighted. But when Venus trines Jupiter, or when Venus hits Jupiter at all, or if Jupiter is in the sign of Libra or Taurus, Jupiter struggles because it seeks to have its self-fulfillment gained through the comfort, the luxurious enjoyment of pleasures of Earth outside of itself, and it's drained of its inner power. Same thing happens with Mercury, except that it's less about the pleasure of lust and the pleasure of romance and even the pleasure of love. It's more about just the pleasure of playing, the pleasure of money and foundational security. This is a Jupiter who will say, I don't care if I could do better. I just want to work some job or do something that will get me money, make me monetarily happy. And that Rajasic quality reduces the Sattvic quality of Jupiter. Of course, for Venus, Saturn, Venus, and Mercury are grouped together. Venus's friends are Saturn and Mercury. Neutral to Venus is Jupiter and Mars. And the enemies of Venus are the Sun and the Moon. And when Venus is associated with the Sun or the Moon, when Venus is in Leo, when Venus is in Cancer, it is starved. The ego, the selfishness, the desire of the self to manifest itself comes through Venus, which is supposed to be a planet of relationship, or a planet of fair communication, of objective detached relationship. Venus is super uber passionate, of course, but in order to be in a relationship and really express love, Venus at its best knows how to express love by being an individual, meeting with another individual, and becoming two wholes meeting to create the figure eight of infinite, pure relationship, because there's a single whole and a single whole. Now, when Venus is coming through the Sun or coming through the Moon, it's starved, and it loses that objectivity. It just says, I need a lover. I identify with being in love. I can't be without love. I can't build myself without a lover, so I need to go and find one, whatever they look like, whatever they are. I'll just grab on to the first one I see, and if it doesn't work out with them, that's going to teach me something about my next relationship. Ultimately, the feeling of being satisfied, the feeling of being in a proper relationship and relating as in a proper relationship is debilitated when Venus is in the sign of Leo or Cancer, or when it's associated with the Sun and the Moon. There's a royalty, a regality in Venus that kind of kills, it assumes that it has strength or power, or that it has wields influence over the partner, and that's why the partner is sticking with you, because you've done something else outside of pure relating in the way that Venus is supposed to relate. Whether that's money, whether that's power, social prestige or influence, or even just in the Moon's case, this is a Venus in Cancer or with the Moon, where the Venus is starved because you are funneling your desire to give love to somebody just for love's sake, just for nurturing's sake, just because you empathize with the other person, trying to save that other person, trying to save yourself through the other person, through helping the other person. Ultimately, none of this is conducive to what a true relationship is, which is an individual and another individual coming together mutually, codependently, but not interdependently, but not codependently, right? Saturn, Venus, and Mercury are once again grouped together for Saturn. Saturn's friends are Venus and Mercury. Neutral to Saturn is Jupiter. And of course, good old, lovely Saturn, being the great guy that he is the planet with the most enemies. Sun, Mars, and Moon are all considered enemies of Saturn. It's just the way Saturn is. Saturn does better with Venus and Mercury because these are planets of relationship, and the instinct to move forward and survive is given a place of understanding when it's involving itself with others and with material finances. Saturn does well in Gemini and in Virgo, where it is learning how to do what it does through logical, rational ways, and it doesn't take things personally in that sense. Saturn is actually exalted in Libra, which was ruled by Venus. Now, Saturn has a hard time in the sign of Leo, where the sense of survival, the sense of self-validation is put on a platform where you're forced to try and validate yourself in a forcefully creative way, which does not jive with the sun, which does not jive with Saturn. Saturn is burned by Leo, by Aries, by Scorpio, and by Cancer. It's kind of starved in any of these places, and if it's associated with any of these planets. In Mars's case, it pushes Saturn too hard, pushes past one's limits, and ultimately is an acid that burns the container that holds it. Saturn does the same thing when it's associated with the sun. The sun, the self-desire for authority, pushes itself so hard that it actually conflicts with one's ability to deal with authority, and it gives one a hard time when dealing with a boss, because you only want to be the boss, but in order to learn to be the boss, you have to be bossed around by somebody. And if you never give yourself the humbleness to do that, then you won't learn to get on top and be the boss. And so Saturn has this weird pressure of hating learning from underneath people, but also hating to be on top of people because they feel bad and embarrassed for the power that was pushed onto them from above. And it complicates things in ways that absolutely do not need to be complicated. Saturn, when associated with the moon and with Cancer, is trying to validate itself through emotional ramparts, through doing things for other people. And ultimately, it's not basing itself on a collective group outside of itself. This is somebody who leans on the people close to it for its emotional strength, its personal fortitude, its objectivity, how it finds detachment from emotions in life. And you can't find detachment from your emotion. Like, Saturn is the one thing that's supposed to pull you through even when you are emotional. It's your job. You're going to keep going to your job, whether you got a heartbreak, whether you got a stomach ache, whether your kids are struggling in school. You know, your job is something that is a stable, familiar structure that pulls you out of yourself. That's why Saturn is exalted in Libra. It's because the things outside of yourself, the relations outside yourself, pull you out of yourself and force you to keep moving even when you don't feel inspired or have any need or inspiration. But when Saturn is in Cancer, it's trying to, the thing which is supposed to be pulling you through and having the basic pulling you through whatever struggles that are in your life, those are other people's emotions. You base your inner fortitude on other people's emotions, which is a fickle place to put your bottom line of capacity to move forward in life. The only way that you can move forward in life is if you have a stable emotional sphere. You're going to be hugging that emotional sphere for dear life. And something tells me that the partners who you squeeze in that way are going to feel where you're coming from. Emotions are supposed to be a mutual flowing of water between two people, a mutual desire for each other's regard, to keep each other afloat just because that's what we love to do, keeping water afloat. But when Saturn gets involved, it almost seems to feel like this Saturn in Cancer person or someone with Saturn opposite or in aspect to the moon or in any way, it almost feels like they're connecting with you in this way because they just desperately need familiar people in order to stay alive. And that just feels almost like you're being used. I mean, not always. If you got positive aspects to that Saturn, then it'll still happen. But it'll be starved. It'll have a hard time keeping its own sense of inner integrity. Saturn does much better in signs like Libra, Taurus, Gemini, Virgo, where those things that can starve Saturn are there. These are based on things outside of itself. Mercury on slow, meticulously building on intellectual pursuits and on understanding and knowledge that will eventually bring it to where it needs to be in the financial world. Saturn fastens itself better to material things rather than emotional things and spiritual things even. It's not what Saturn's for. Saturn can find great spirituality, but It's more like Saturn needs to express the spirituality of these planets by having constructive channels that are intelligent and worldly wise, in the sense of Mercury, finances, like having a decent enough stable job and brushing your teeth and doing all the little things to keep you as an able-bodied physical vessel so that you can survive, because Saturn and Mercury will last. Saturn associated with Mercury will have the information it needs to do well. Saturn associated with Venus will have the good feelings and wisdom and worldly understanding and recreational networking and relationships to help get it through its limits and its hard times. As for Rahu and Ketu, their friendships are not specified by tradition, although some Jyotishis use the friends, neutrals, and enemies of Saturn for Rahu, and they use the friends, neutrals, and enemies of Mars for Ketu. That's something that we can, look to my Rahu and Ketu videos in order to see what that's all about. Essentially, you'll find that Rahu leans on Saturn for its expression and survival, while Ketu leans on Mars for its expression and survival. But that's intermediary stuff for later on. Now, a last little bit about all this. When Mars occupies the constellation Taurus, which is ruled by Venus, he occupies the constellation of a planet who is neutral to him. Mars is there placed indifferently, neither strong nor weak. Similarly, if Mercury is in the sign of Capricorn or Aquarius, both ruled by Saturn, then Mercury sits in a constellation whose lord is neutral to Mercury. Note, though, that if Saturn is in the constellation of Gemini or Virgo, which are ruled by Mercury, then Saturn occupies the constellation whose lord is friendly to him. And Saturn is therefore strong for either beneficial or detrimental reasons. The relationship between two grahas is thus not always reciprocal, just as relationships between two humans are not always reciprocal. And that makes sense, right? So that's it for this video, folks, describing the planetary friendship and enmity between two grahas. We're going to have a quick little episode on the next one, just giving a summary of all these types of strengths. And then we're going to move on to planetary states. So keep watching, folks. We got a few more things before the end of Chapter 4. I'll be talking to you soon.